I was a little bit cautious going into the 8th Doctor Time War series because, as I've said before, I've had certain reservations about actually trying to take this huge and broad concept of a war across the 4th dimension and fully fleshing it out and realising it, because it strikes me as the sort of idea that works best by keeping it inconceivable, making its horrors seem almost unimaginable and saying that they take place outside of reality as we know it. That makes a bit more sense to me. It cloaks it in mystery and awe, rather than it just being soldier, Time Lords and Daleks doing a shooty thing on a battlefield on a planet somewhere and they go blam blam. Cause I can imagine that. I'm imagining that right now, and it basically just looks like Star Wars or any other sci-fi franchise. It just wouldn't really do that much justice to this big and weighty title like The Time War. That's not to say that there's not potential for some good stories in there, but just painting it as just Daleks blow shit up would feel a bit weak when you've got the idea of a battle across the 4th dimension to play with. I knew there'd probably be too much temptation to do it like that, and that's also why I've put off bothering with the War Doctor box sets. That and the Loan Sharks who fund my Big Finish addiction have already broken one of my legs, and I'd quite like to keep the other one intact for the time being. Fortunately, the 8th Doctor Time War 1 box set did have a fair few weird and trippy surprises up its sleeve. In the first half at least. It does fall into a few of those what I expected of someone actually trying to write the Time War traps in the second half, but I'll get there. So the box set opens with Starship Theseus, which was just on the cusp of being this bizarre deconstructionalist masterpiece, but it never quite gets there. So the 8th Doctor shows up on a luxury cruise liner with a random new companion, where guests are mysteriously disappearing below decks for some reason. I wonder why. Maybe it's a monster. Which, yes, sounds like every Doctor Who story ever written, but as it goes on, details keep changing. The companion's never properly introduced, and her name and background change every few minutes or so. One minute her name's Sheena, next it's Emma, next it's Louise, and the cruise liner sort of oscillates between being a budget holiday ship and a convoy for refugees. Once I'd started realising what Starship Theseus was doing by painting a Doctor Who story that sounds like the most generic hack piece of shit ever, but then drawing attention to how all of the elements are completely interchangeable, I was totally in love with it. However, it never went quite far enough with this idea for me. It just sort of swaps details occasionally. When I say it should have gone further, I was imagining his companion being this sinister-seeming shape-shifting entity who you can never really pin down. One minute she's a girl from 21st century Earth, next she's a gritty, hardened space captain. Sort of like the parasites out of that episode of Rick and Morty who take on the form of a fake loved one who makes you think that you've known them all your life. Then about halfway through, Sheena, or Emma, vanishes, and everyone's wondering if she was ever there at all, and it's pretty effective, but I was still left wanting more from this idea. There were sparks here for what the Time War series could end up being that made me go, love it, love it, love it, I was wrong, fleshing out the Time War is a good idea. And then in the third act the Daleks show up and it just sort of veers into blam blam war stuff. Though the Daleks are pretty well written here, they actually seem like a properly menacing presence and do the all-important thing of mercilessly killing people all of the time. You remember what that was like, everyone? Remember? Memories. But while I enjoyed it, I was a bit disappointed that I was given a taste of weird Time War trippiness, and then it just sort of starts doing what I expected of a Time War box set. But yeah, Starship Theseus sets up the premise of timelines and events becoming fluid and amorphous pretty well, and it genuinely makes you laugh hearing characters try and pin down exactly what's been going on so far in the narrative. While I thoroughly enjoyed it, I guess my problem with Starship Theseus was that it wasn't pretentious enough. While I'm on this one, I've got this idea that I keep pestering Big Finish on Twitter to commission for a story called Coming Soon, where the Doctor shows up in an unfinished story where he and the companion run between unfinished sets away from a monster that's just a sentient white box that says, "Insert monster here." Come on, Big Finish, I know your audience. Us neckbeards would lap that shit up, trust me. The following story, Echoes of War, is easily the strongest in the box set. It sees the Doctor and the survivors of the crashed starship, oh yeah, spoiler warning, journeying through a bizarre alien forest affected by time distortion weaponry with a damaged Dalek that the Doctor's manipulated into helping them avoid echoes and ghosts of battles seen on the planet either in the past or the future. Echoes of War is pretty much everything I wanted out of a Time War story. There's some brilliant ideas in there, some dazed and confused and lost travellers wandering through a bizarre aging and de-aging landscape cycling through time. It treats the concept of the Time War less like a literal war and more like the universe itself is in a state of flux because of the usage of temporal-based weaponry, and it's bloody marvellous. Though I will admit there's some dialogue in there that's quite openly, let's paint a picture with words, because the imagery used in Echoes of War is very detailed and probably more suited to being a trippy episode of the show than an audio production. That doesn't put me off, it's very striking imagery and it's highly engaging, but I will admit that it can break the suspension of disbelief on occasion. The next story is called The Conscript, and in my opinion it's a pretty huge step down from Echoes of War. It's basically everything I was afraid this series would turn out to be, and you gotta remember that I do say all of this as someone who's never really found war movies that compelling. I'm more into the PTSD shell-shock stuff that comes after a war. I remember reading Pat Barker's Regeneration during my A-levels, for example, and I liked it a lot. But The Conscript is basically the boring domestic part of a war movie. So the Doctor's drafted into the Gallifreyan army and spends the whole episode among the recruits as they're training to fight the Daleks on a battlefield. Like a literal battlefield, not a metaphysical one. It's all target practice and push-ups and shit. This goes on for about 45 minutes, and it's the kind of dull but annoyingly necessary fleshing out the narrative component of a war story. I mean, it's kind of fun to see the Doctor being a disobedient shit and rebelling against the army captains attempting to drill subservience into the recruits. And he also gives a bloody brilliant little speech right towards the end about the approach the generals are taking to training their recruits, which was resonant of the kind of criticism of generals from World War I back in the day. It's just that the rest of it's kinda dull and it doesn't really feel worth it for a decent speech alone. It's like the Zygon inversion. Oh, come on, you know I'm right! Anyway, about 130 words ago, you may remember that I said that the Conscript was the type of boring but necessary fleshing out component of a war story. And that's what I thought throughout the bulk of the runtime, but when listening to the Doctor's speech, I was kinda struggling to justify the word necessary. I mean, I get that war implies that there would be some sort of militaristic element to it, and given everything that's been established about the Doctor's role as a renegade in the war, I guess it makes sense to give him something to rebel against and play out what basically acts as Act 1 of a war movie. But a lot of what he says about their methods of training should be shit-blisteringly obvious to time-sensitive godlike beings from another world. They're sending Time Lords in to battle the Daleks, well aware that the Dalek weapons have regeneration inhibitors. It's just a bit caricature-ish. The Time Lord generals are like, "Grr, we have to be mean pricks to toughen the soldiers up. Give me 50 push-ups now. Target practice at dawn, Private." Echoes of War just screamed battle across the fourth dimension, whereas The Conscript was basically just any other opening chapter of a war story. And it's a part 3 as well, which is a bit baffling, ain't it? I don't want to be as harsh as I'm sounding here, it's not the worst thing ever, but it's just a bit of a dull slog all told, and it contains pretty much all of the missteps that I was hoping the Time War series would avoid taking. The final story is called One Life, and there's going to be some pretty big spoilers in here in case I hadn't mentioned that already. Okay, spoiler time, okay. It turns out that Bruce Willis was dead the entire time. Okay, no, just kidding, okay. The spoiler is, it was Earth all along. Okay, no, just kidding, okay. The reason that the Time Lords wanted to find the Doctor and force him into the war effort is that he's unknowingly been travelling with this secret weapon that can unravel time and space. And the secret weapon isn't a thing, it's one of the people he's been travelling with. Which one of the people could it be? And the twist is that it isn't Bliss, the 20-something grad student engineer lady that he's been travelling with throughout this box set, who was always obviously going to go on to become the Doctor's long-running companion in the Time War series, because she fits all the archetypes. No, secret weapon's not her, okay? It's that guy over there who the Doctor's also been travelling with since the Theseus, who was on holiday with his wife. Zumagur, shock, horror, revelation thing. So Wherein is secretly this super powerful Time Lord who stored his personality in a pocket watch because he wanted to escape the war. And the episode is mostly the Doctor and co helping keep his Time Lord personality in the Watch because he wants to stay human and live in peace far away from all this with his wife, while the Time Lords want him to be restored to his former self to help them win the war. While One Life was very technobabble heavy and it does slow up on occasion, it was surprisingly enjoyable. Though the Quarian revelation would have carried a bit more weight if we'd had his character and his relationship with his wife Rupert a bit more firmly entrenched earlier on and throughout the box set. There are some flashbacks in this one painting a nice little portrait of their marriage and the tragedy of when time starts fluctuating, which do the job pretty well, but I just think the revelation would have meant a bit more if he and Rupert had had a bit of a stronger presence and more focus earlier on and throughout the box set. There was a decent amount of characterization for them both in the second half of Starship of Theseus and in Echoes of War, but it just could have been a bit more prominent in my opinion. I mean, there is a reason that I didn't get round to talking about them at all until now. All in all, there is plenty to like in Time War 1. Namely Echoes of War. And yeah, I will be continuing with it. There's seeds of an interesting series in here, though it didn't totally set my doubts at bay about attempting to adapt the Time War. As much as Whovians obsessed over it for years and the mythologizing of the concept took hold, I'd always had this slight feeling that an attempt to portray it would seem weak and disappointing when compared to the myth that's been built up around it. This did prove me wrong on some fronts, but pretty damn right on others. Though as said, I'm going to stick around for the occasions that it proves me wrong, because being proven wrong does feel pretty fucking great.